The mud had finally stopped moving. For 3 days, the earth beneath Bethel, New York, had churned like a living thing, trampled by 400,000 pairs of feet, turned into a slurry by relentless torrential rains, and mixed with the discarded debris of a generation trying to find its soul. But now, as the pale, watery sun of Monday, August 18, 1969, began to bleed through the gray cloud cover, the ground was still. The chaos of the 3 days of peace and music had largely evaporated, leaving behind a scene that resembled the aftermath of a Civil War battle more than a festival. The hills were littered with wet sleeping bags, abandoned tie-dyed shirts, crushed paper cups, and the skeleton frames of tents left behind in the exodus. The air smelled of wet wool, stale marijuana smoke, ozone, and the distinct, earthy rot of a farm that had been pushed beyond its limits. Most of the tribes had fled. They had jobs to return to, parents to answer to, and realities to face. The revolution was over, or so it seemed, disbanded by the mundane necessity of Monday morning. But backstage, in the precarious shelter of a plywood structure that vibrated with the hum of generators, Jimi Hendrix was awake, and he was waiting. He had been waiting for what felt like a lifetime. The schedule had dissolved days ago. He was the headliner, the highest-paid act of the festival, the man chosen to close the circle. He was supposed to play at midnight on Sunday, the climax of the weekend, the moment when the energy would be at its absolute peak. Instead, he watched as midnight came and went. Then 2 a.m. Then 4 a.m. The rain came and went, shorting out equipment, turning the stage into an electrical death trap. Other bands played on, fighting exhaustion and technical gremlins. The Grateful Dead had been shocked by their microphones. Sly and the Family Stone had ignited the night, but that fire had long since burned out. Now, at 8:30 in the morning, Jimmy sat on a road case, his white Fender Stratocaster resting across his knees like a loaded weapon. His manager, Mike Jeffrey, was pacing the small enclosure, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. Jeffrey was a man of the old world, a man of contracts and leverage, and he saw the empty field as a personal insult and a financial disaster. "This is insane, Jimmy," Jeffrey hissed, gesturing toward the stage curtain where the morning light was creeping in. "Look out there. They're gone. It's a ghost town. You're Jimi Hendrix. You don't play for the cleanup crew. We should have left hours ago. We can claim breach of contract. We can leave right now." Jimmy didn't look up. He was tuning the high E string, his ear pressed close to the body of the guitar, listening to the resonance of the wood. To him, the size of the crowd was irrelevant. The contract was irrelevant. There was a vibration in the air, a strange, static tension that he hadn't felt in a long time. "No," Jimmy said, his voice barely a whisper, yet cutting through the noise of the roadies packing up gear. "I'm not leaving. The people who are supposed to hear this, they're still here. Let them go. We play for the ones who stayed." The band he had assembled for this moment, a sprawling, somewhat under-rehearsed ensemble he called Gypsy Sun and Rainbows, looked terrified. Mitch Mitchell, his faithful drummer from the Experience days, looked ragged, his eyes rimmed with red, twirling a drumstick nervously. Billy Cox, Jimmy's old army buddy on bass, stood stoic, trusting Jimmy implicitly but sensing the awkwardness of the moment. They were about to walk out onto the biggest stage in the world, only to find the theater virtually empty. The vast sea of humanity that had defined Woodstock was gone. In its place was a scattered remnant of perhaps 200,000 people, though from the stage, it looked like far less, maybe just 30,000 or 40,000 diehards, too stoned, too tired, or too mesmerized to move. They were the refugees of the festival, wrapped in blankets, standing in the mud, waiting for one last sermon. Jimmy stood up. He smoothed the front of his white leather jacket, the fringe swaying with his movements. He adjusted the red headband that held back his wild, unkempt afro. He looked like a weary shaman, a traveler from a different dimension who had landed in a muddy pasture in upstate New York. He walked toward the stage ramp, the wood creaking under his boots. As he stepped out into the morning light, the reality of the scene hit him. It wasn't just the small crowd, it was the silence. Usually, a Hendrix concert was a wall of screaming, a physical force of adulation. Today, there was just a polite ripple of applause, swallowed instantly by the vast open space. It felt intimate, almost uncomfortably so. It felt like a soundcheck at the end of the world. "Good morning," Jimi said into the microphone. His voice echoed across the valley, bouncing off the distant trees. It was soft, devoid of the rock star swagger he often projected. He sounded humble, almost apologetic. "We just want to say hi to everybody and tell you to have a nice day and a safe journey home." He paused, looking at the faces in the front row, kids with mud dried on their cheeks, eyes wide and hollow. "I see a lot of you are leaving, that's cool. We're just gonna jam a little bit." He turned to his amp stack, a towering wall of Marshall cabinets that were his altar and his artillery. He reached out and flipped the standby switches. The hum of the tubes warming up was a familiar comfort, a 60-cycle thrum that signaled the beginning of the ritual. For the next hour, the performance was a mixture of brilliance and chaos. The new band was shaky. They stumbled over changes, struggling to keep up with Jimi's mercurial improvisations. But Jimi was in a trance. He carried them, his guitar weaving a safety net of sound beneath their feet. They played "Message to Love," they played "Red House," the blues standard that grounded Jimi in the earth. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist, and the crowd began to wake up. They shook off the dampness of the night. They stood up. They started to dance, a slow, rhythmic swaying in the mud. But Jimi was looking for something else. He was searching for a sound that could articulate the specific heaviness of 1969. The context of that morning was not just the mud of Bethel, it was the blood of Vietnam. Half a world away, boys the same age as the one sleeping in the field were wading through rice paddies, carrying M16s, dying for reasons they couldn't articulate. The country was tearing itself apart. The assassinations of King and Kennedy were still fresh wounds. The cities were burning. The counterculture, for all its talk of peace and love, was beginning to feel the cold edge of cynicism. The establishment viewed them as enemies of the state viewed them as cannon fodder. Jimi stood at the intersection of these two worlds, a black man who had been a paratrooper, a counterculture icon who had been monitored by the FBI, a musician who wanted to transcend race and politics but was constantly defined by them. He finished "Voodoo Child," "Slight Return," the final notes echoing into the hills. The band quieted down. Jimi stepped back to the mic. His demeanor shifted. The playfulness was gone. "I'd like to get something straight," he mumbled, almost to himself. "We're just jamming, that's all. We're just musicians, and we just want to get something straight with you guys. This is the national anthem we're going to play. It's not unorthodox. It's just us." And then, he hit the first note. It wasn't a chord. It was a single, piercing declaration. The low E string, struck with a ferocity that sent a spike of voltage through the Marshalls. "Oh, say can you see?" The melody was instantly recognizable. It was the song they had all heard in school assemblies, at baseball games, on television sign-offs. It was the hymn of the establishment, the song of the fathers who sent them to war. But in Jimi's hands, on that white Stratocaster, it was being transmuted. He played the first few bars relatively straight, letting the melody establish itself, letting the audience recognize the familiar shape of the song. But the tone was different. It was thick, saturated with fuzz face distortion, heavy with the weight of the moment. Then, as he reached the line, and the rocket's red glare, the world fell away. Jimi stepped on his Univibe pedal. He grabbed the tremolo arm of his guitar, the whammy bar, and he didn't just dip it, he strangled it. He plunged the pitch of the guitar down into the subsonic depths, mimicking the Doppler effect of a falling bomb. Whoosh-whoosh. The sound was terrifyingly literal. It wasn't a musical note, it was the sound of a B-52 payload whistling through the air over the jungle canopy. He brought the bar back up, screaming into a high-pitched squeal that sounded like shrapnel tearing through metal. The crowd stood frozen. This was not the Star-Spangled Banner of Francis Scott Key. This was a sonic exorcism. Jimi was using the electric guitar to paint a landscape of war. He created the sound of machine gun fire by toggling his pickup selector switch and hitting the strings, a staccato rat-tat-tat-tat that echoed across the peaceful farm. He used feedback to create the screams of the dying, letting the amplifier howl in agony before wrestling it back into the melody. It was a grotesque, beautiful, terrifying display of control. He was taking the symbol of the nation and showing the nation what it had become. He wasn't disrespecting the anthem, he was reporting the news. He was playing the reality of America in 1969, the beauty and the horror, entangled in a single melody. For those few minutes, time seemed to suspend. The 200 diehards in the mud were witnessing a man wrestling with the soul of a country. Jimi's eyes were closed, his head thrown back, his body arching with the physical effort of controlling the feedback. He was walking a tightrope between noise and music. One slip, and it would just be discordant garbage. But he didn't slip. He guided the chaos, forcing the noise to resolve back into the melody. Gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. He played that line with a heartbreaking tenderness, a sudden shift from the violence of the bombs to a fragile, weeping sustain. It was a question, is it still there? Is the dream still there? When he finally resolved the anthem, letting the last note dissolve into the opening riff of Purple Haze, there was no immediate applause. The silence that followed the anthem was heavier than the silence before the concert. It was the silence of shock. People were crying. People were staring at the stage with their mouths open. They had expected a rock concert, they had been given a history lesson written in lightning. It took a moment for them to realize that the song was over, and when they did, the applause was different. It wasn't the raucous cheering of a party, it was the deep, resonant validation of a congregation that had just witnessed a miracle. Unknown to Jimi, the cameras were rolling. The documentary crew, exhausted and running out of film, had managed to capture this sequence. The grainy, 16mm footage of Jimi in the morning light, his white jacket glowing, his fingers tearing the anthem apart, would become the definitive image of the 1960s. But in that moment, it felt intensely private. It was a secret shared between the artist and the few who stayed. In the weeks and months that followed, the repercussions of those 3.5 minutes would ripple out in ways Jimi never intended. The FBI, under the paranoid direction of J. Edgar Hoover, had already labeled Jimi a subversive influence. They saw his influence over the youth, his proximity to the Black Panthers, though he kept his distance politically, and his unapologetic blackness as a threat. The Woodstock performance was analyzed by agents in suits who didn't know a cord from a cable. They saw it as an act of desecration. They saw it as anti-American propaganda. They intensified the surveillance. His phone lines in New York were tapped. Agents were placed in the crowds of his shows, scribbling notes about his lyrics and his inflammatory stage demeanor. Conservative media outlets picked up the story. They called it a disgrace. They demanded that radio stations ban his music. They tried to paint Jimi as a traitor. But Jimi, in his typical enigmatic fashion, refused to take the bait. When he appeared on the Dick Cavett show weeks later, Cavett asked him about the controversy regarding the anthem. Jimi looked genuinely puzzled. He smiled that shy, lopsided smile and said, "I didn't think it was unorthodox. I thought it was beautiful." When pressed about the chaotic nature of the rendition, he simply said, "We play it the way the air is in America today. The air is slightly static, see?" That phrase, "the air is slightly static," was perhaps the most profound political statement he ever made. He wasn't an ideologue. He wasn't a politician. He was an antenna. He picked up the vibrations of the world around him, the anger, the fear, the hope, the violence, and he amplified them through his Marshall stacks. He didn't need to write a protest song with lyrics about the war, he played the war itself. He bypassed the intellectual defenses of the listener and went straight to the nervous system. As 1969 turned into 1970, the weight of being Jimi Hendrix, the symbol, began to crush Jimi Hendrix, the man. The audience demanded the hits. They wanted him to burn the guitar. They wanted him to play with his teeth. They wanted the clown, not the artist. The Woodstock anthem had elevated him to a level of scrutiny that made it impossible to breathe. He retreated into the studio, into the construction of Electric Lady, trying to find a place where he could just be a musician again. But the shadow of Woodstock followed him. Every time he stepped on stage, the expectation was there: do something historic. Shock us. Save us. The irony of the Woodstock performance remains its greatest tragedy. The vast majority of the people who claim to have been at Woodstock, the nearly 500,000 who bought the tickets or crashed the gates, never saw it. They were stuck in traffic on the New York Thruway, or they were asleep in their muddy tents, or they had already gone home to wash the weekend off their skin. They missed the defining moment of their own generation. It was a gift given to the stragglers, the ones who had nowhere else to go, the ones who couldn't bear to leave the magic circle until the very last note had faded. Jimi Hendrix died just 13 months later, in September 1970, alone in a London hotel room, a victim of the very chaos he tried to transmute into art. He was 27 years old. The conspiracy theories would swirl for decades. Was it the mob? Was it the manager? Was it the FBI, terrified of the man who could turn the national anthem into a weapon? But the truth was likely far more mundane and far more tragic: a young man, exhausted, isolated, and overwhelmed, making a simple, fatal mistake with sleeping pills. But the anthem didn't die. It grew. As the footage from the Woodstock movie circulated, the performance took on a life of its own. It became the soundtrack to the anti-war movement. It became a piece of avant-garde art studied in conservatories. It became the benchmark against which every other version of the anthem would be measured. Before Jimi, the anthem was a rigid, military march. After Jimi, it was a living, breathing, malleable thing. He liberated the song just as he had liberated the guitar. Today, if you go to the site of the Woodstock Festival, the field is green and manicured. There is a monument. It is quiet. But if you stand there long enough, and if you listen closely to the wind coming off the Catskill Mountains, you can almost hear it. You can hear the hum of the amplifiers. You can hear the static in the air. You can hear the sound of a single white Stratocaster screaming into the Monday morning light, asking the question that America is still trying to answer. Say, does that Star-Spangled Banner yet wave? And in the feedback and the distortion, Jimi gave us the answer: it waves, but it is tattered, it is burned, and it is beautiful because it has survived the bombs. The people who stayed that morning, the 200 witnesses to history, carried that sound with them for the rest of their lives. They knew that they had seen something that couldn't be explained, only felt. They saw a man strip away the artifice of patriotism and reveal the raw, beating heart of a nation in crisis. And in doing so, Jimi Hendrix didn't just play a song, he stopped time. He proved that a guitar, in the right hands, is more powerful than a gun, more truthful than a speech, and more enduring than the history books that try to explain it. He played the truth, and the truth was loud.